Thanks for joining us for our first forum of the new ministry year. It's been a while since we've been in here together. So this year will look familiar and a little different at the same time. You'll notice, you know me, whereas some of the other times we meet together, we have a guest speaker. Our staff will be leading these forums this year, as well as some of our lay leaders, such as Jennifer Wilson, who's sitting right here. I'm going to call her out for a second. She'll be one of our leaders later this fall. But we are going to be focusing on spiritual practices this fall. Some may know the term spiritual disciplines. I like to use the word practice because discipline sometimes sounds a little scary. But when we were thinking with the Adult Faith Formation Council last spring what we might focus on this year, we've done a lot of really heavy topics the past 2 years in this time and in small groups, which have all been great. And we've had a lot of really good conversations about sexuality and gender and faith, about theology, liberation theology, feminist theology, but a lot of really heavy intellectual, heady kind of stuff, which has pushed us all probably and challenged us and been really great, but also that can be exhausting at times. And as we're in this season of transition with our interim pastor and different things, we felt like we wanted to speak to our hearts and minds during this time together and really connect with one another, because we think that's what we really need right now as we're in a season of transition. And so we're going to be doing that in our small groups. You're going to have time to just be with one another, and that's going to be a way for you to find community during your month. And we'll have time to practice these spiritual practices that we'll be talking about. And then in here, this will be a little more informal. I do want it to be a little interactive. I have some questions I want you to actually answer and share with at your tables. And there will be time for us to practice these practices together here in this space. I'm going to go ahead and tell you, each month is going to look pretty different. We are going to try to do a variety of spiritual practices. So they're going to look and feel very different. Some of them you may be familiar with, some of them may be new to you. Some we may be sitting and it may be quiet in here. Others we may be talking and doing something with our hands and moving around or different things. And that's the point of that, is to introduce you to a wide variety of ways that you can connect with God and practice your faith. And they're going to look different, and that's okay. And so we hope that you'll dive into this experience together with us. And so to get started this evening, I wanted to start with kind of an overview of different spiritual practices and what that can look like. And then we'll focus on one specifically, which you'll need your handout for later. If you want to take notes, if you're a note taker, you can write on the back. We won't need the back of that piece of paper. But yeah, so first I want to ask you, because you are all very knowledgeable, experienced people, what would you define as a spiritual practice or a spiritual discipline? Prayers, one, yeah. Fasting, Bible study, Lent, yeah. Yeah, participating in Lent. And that can look like many different things, right? Worship. Meditation, stillness, quiet, solitude. Those are really fun, energetic things, right? Do you often think about spiritual practices as being kind of like quiet, calm things? Yeah. Can you think of any spiritual practices that are the opposite of that? Or might be a little more lively? Singing, worship. Services? Oh, serving others. Yeah, service. Walking. Yeah. Maybe you walk in nature, or you go on prayer walks, or just walk with a friend. That could be a spiritual practice. So you'll see in these answers that we all have different opinions about what that might look like in different perspectives. And so I hope that through this process, you'll be introduced to new ones, maybe something that you haven't tried before, maybe something that's unique and a little different from what your spiritual practice may look like. And we want you to be able to find some comfort in ones that are familiar too. So one, would help if I turn this on. One quote about spiritual practices I found says, spiritual practices help us to lean into our innate connection with the divine and put us into a posture to experience that connection more often and in a more profound way. So spiritual practices can really be anything. I mean, the list, we think of the normal things, prayer, worship, fasting, but it can be anything you do, any action or practice that turns our posture towards God and our connection makes our connection a little deeper, right? Spiritual practices are not rules, but practices that can become habitual and lead us towards transformation. So what our spiritual practices are not, they're not brownie points. No one's getting a grade in this session together. It's not a way to get on God's good list, which also isn't a thing. They don't make us better Christians. We don't get an A on a report card or anything like that, like we do in school. And so I think a lot of times, though, especially as children, we might have been taught, like, you need to read your Bible, you need to pray, you need to do this, this, and this to be a good Christian. So for some of us, spiritual practices may be uncomfortable because we don't want it to feel like it's something we have to do and something that, we get demerits on if we don't do them. But rather, spiritual practices transform us and allow God to work within us as we connect with God and connect with one another. And so I want to introduce you to two books that have been helpful for me in spiritual practices. One of them, many of you might be familiar with. It's Richard Foster's Celebration of Discipline. So that's kind of like the classic book on spiritual disciplines. It's called Celebration of Discipline. And one thing he says in his book is that spiritual disciplines are liberating. It's probably not the first word you might use when you hear the word discipline, right? But by that, he means that they free us to be transformed by God's presence and God's grace. He says the spiritual disciplines are an inward and spiritual reality, and the inner attitude of the heart is far more crucial than mechanics for coming into the reality of the spiritual life. Another book that has been helpful to me is called The Spiritual Disciplines Handbook. Pretty self-explanatory there, but that's by Adele Calhoun. She says that transformation happens as you keep company with Jesus. And I like that phrase because there's a lot of ways you can keep company with someone, right? So it's about connecting with God, being transformed. And she says that we bring our desire to know God, our longing to belong, and our desperation to make a difference in this world to these spiritual practices so that we may be transformed. The point of a spiritual practice is to make space for our minds and our hearts to be open to how God's already at work in our lives and the world around us amid the chaos and the craziness of our lives that we experience each day. So we've mentioned some of these already, but are there others? What, as a church as Greystone, what are spiritual practices that we already practice together? Someone mentioned worship. That's pretty obvious. What are other ways that we as a congregation do this? We can talk about some ones we already talked about. So we said prayer, worship, music, service is a big one with missions and things. Any others we haven't mentioned? Yeah. Serving through missions and the construction team. Serving through Spirit of Justice Council. I mean, the ways that you serve even here at Greystone on a council is an act of service, right? It doesn't always have to be serving elsewhere. All of you, in some capacity, serve here too, right? Coming to Wednesday night, yeah, that can be a great spiritual practice for your whole year. Yeah, so there's many that we already practice together, and sometimes we don't always think about it as a spiritual practice. The way that we gather around tables, we eat together, we fellowship. We do one every month. We just did it this past Sunday. Communion. Sunday school is one. Yes, that's a great answer. Studying the Bible, learning the stories of God, talking with one another about our faith, that can be a spiritual practice. There's many different ways that we do that. You know who also did spiritual practices? Jesus. Jesus taught us how to pray through the Lord's Prayer and different ways like that. He modeled how to pray. Jesus gathered around a lot of tables. He instituted communion. He meditated, he fasted, he spent time with God. And then one we haven't mentioned that was pretty important for Jesus and early Christians was Sabbath. So that is one that we might talk about at some point this year. What other practices did Jesus model for us? Forgiveness. Forgiveness can be a spiritual practice for sure. It's one of the harder ones. Confession kind of goes with that too. Partying and being with people. Fellowship, gathering, community. Jesus partied, we can say that. He turned water into wine, you know. Feeding people. He fed a lot of people, that's for sure. And some of you have that gift too, right? Community service. Yes, taking care of physical needs. That can be healing, that can be a spiritual practice and helping. Tithing, yes. I thought you said hiding. I was like, okay. Tithing, yes. Giving, stewardship. That's a big one too. Rest. I would say that it can be separate because, I mean, it's both. But yes, rest can look like a lot of different things, as we've learned this summer, as we've been resting, and playing could probably be a spiritual practice, and experiencing God's creation. So I want to talk a little bit about what spiritual practices have looked like throughout church history. Going back to the Bible times, this verse will probably look familiar because we read it on Sunday. But from the beginning, the church has linked the desire for more of God to intentional practices in relationships and experience. And so what we now know as spiritual practices, it's seen throughout scripture and then in just history of the early church. And so in Acts, we read, they devoted themselves to teaching. Teaching is also a spiritual practice. Fellowship, breaking of bread, and prayer. And so, spiritual practices and disciplines and these official kind of categories that we know now have come out of people's desire just to know God and be transformed. We've had those common threads of worship throughout church history and different channels that have consistently brought us towards God's grace. Monastic communities throughout church history have also modeled a lot of these spiritual practices for us. And then, once modernization kind of happened, a lot of our spiritual practices became a lot more individualized. Personal Bible study and quiet time. That wasn't a thing, before people had the printing press to be able to read the Bible themselves. They could pray, but there wasn't the pressure to do it on your own, which I think a lot of us feel that way now. A lot of spiritual practice was communal in the early church. And now with a technological age, a lot of this time is urging us to focus on practices that slow life down a little more because we've sped up a lot. And allow us to center on God, and unplugging could be a spiritual practice. That's actually one of the ones listed in the handbook, which, probably wasn't on their mind for the monastic community way back when. But they evolve and they change, and with time, and there's more. I mean, anything truly could be a spiritual practice if it's allowing you to connect with God and be transformed. And so there are, experts and scholars who have kind of categorized spiritual practices in different ways. And so the two books I mentioned, they categorize them very differently. Richard Foster categorizes spiritual disciplines as either an inward practice, so you might not see it on the outside, something like meditation, individual prayer, fasting. You may not know that someone's fasting, and as you walk by them, versus outward practices, serving with somebody. You probably could recognize that a little better. Other ones like that include simplicity is also a practice, and solitude. And then we have corporate disciplines, which some of the inward outward can also be corporate if you do them together. But those corporate ones include things like confession, worship, guidance, and my favorite spiritual discipline, celebration. So there's the partying piece of that. But the way that we celebrate together when we have meals and we celebrate our anniversary every year, things like that. Now, Calhoun's categories are a little different. She breaks them down as worship, opening ourselves to God, relinquishing the false self, sharing our lives with others, hearing God's word, incarnating the love of Christ, and praying. And there's a million ways to pray. We're going to look at some of those this season with this series. It's not just closing your eyes, talking aloud or in your head. We're going to look at breath prayers, there's centering prayer, conversational prayer, intercessory prayer, labyrinths, liturgical prayers, lament. The list goes on and on. So why practice a spiritual practice? I think finding the right practice is hard, especially because some come more naturally to us than others. One of you may really love to fast. Christian loves fasting. I don't. I need to eat lunch during the day. And some of us may love to pray out loud. Some of us may like to write down our prayers. Some of us love to, express our faith through music. Some of us not so much, and that's okay. But in order to be able to find what you enjoy and how you best connect with God, it takes practice. In the same way that you exercise a muscle to get stronger, in the same way that you practice piano to get better at get better at playing, you got to practice these things, right? But I think the most important thing about practicing spiritual practices is that you have to practice in community. You may not be with the people all the time to do the practice, but I think there's some accountability in it. But I think you are more receptive to God's presence together, because you'll hear from people's experiences what their experience has been practicing, and you can grow from that and learn from that. But being in a relationship with one another allows us to experience God's presence on a deeper level. And it's a journey. You're not going to become a pro at doing these things overnight. Some of them you may really hate. Some people don't want to sit in silence for 30 minutes, which I'm not going to ask you to do. I promise. You can do that on your own. But, it's different for every single person. So I want you to turn to your neighbor, your table, and share a little bit about your experiences with spiritual practices or disciplines. We're going to give you a couple of minutes to talk about what have been ones that you enjoy, what are ones that you've wanted to try, are there spiritual practices or disciplines you're familiar with? Share for a few minutes with those around you. Okay, we're going to come back together. You're going to have time during your small groups on this first meeting in a couple weeks to have the same kind of discussion too. So tonight, I'm going to introduce one specific spiritual practice that I have enjoyed, and that was introduced to me several years ago. It's one that I've also introduced to our youth in different ways. And so we're going to talk about the Examen, which it's not a test, don't worry. So some of you may have heard of this. Some of you are like, what is that? Who's this guy right here? So this is a practice that was created by Ignatius Loyola, I struggle to say that word, the Jesuit priest or the saint, who wanted the missionaries in his society to know how to detect the movement of God in their lives. So that was the purpose of him coming up with this practice. He believed discernment came out of awareness of how God moved uniquely in each soul. And so this practice is used for discerning the voice and activity of God within the flow of the day. It's a vehicle that creates deeper awareness of God-given desires of one's life. And so the Examen involves setting time aside in your day to reflect on the presence of God in your life, which, seems pretty simple and easy. However, I know I would struggle I struggle to think about God at some point in my day. I mean, our days are full, right? Many of you have been going since you woke up this morning, and things are out of our control. Things come up, phone calls happen, emails, flow in, and it's hard to pause and to actually reflect during your day. Maybe it's easier to do it right before you go to sleep, or maybe it's you wait till the end of the week to kind of think about what's been going on in your life. But this practice is well, Ignatius asked his people to do it twice a day, which seems like a lot, honestly, to be able to pause and find time to do this. But it's a centuries-old practice that invites us to reflect on our day prayerfully in God's presence. It's not a formula. There aren't rules to this, but there are some guiding steps that help us reflect on the past and reset for the future. It's a great tool for discerning places that give you life that you're grateful for, where you're most present in your life, and maybe some places where you might not feel those things. And so it can be done as an individual prayer. It can be done through journaling. It can be done by talking to a trusted friend or even in a shared setting. And so the general steps of the Examen, there are 5 of them that can be adapted. If you look up Examen practices, they all can look a little different, but these are kind of the standard 5, and people adapt them in different ways, which these are listed on the top left of your handout, so you don't have to write all these words down. But number 1 is to become aware of God's presence. That can be easier to do sometimes than others. But often what people do to begin would be, to breathe deeply, to find a place where you are going to be less distracted by what's around you, to find a comfortable seat, whatever you need to do to become aware of God's presence. The second step would be to review the day with gratitude. So to first think about what you're grateful for. Now, there's probably things that happened in your day that you're not grateful for, but the point is to first focus on gratitude. The third step would be to pay attention to your emotions. This can come easily for others, and not so easily for some people, but paying attention to what you're feeling in the moment. Depending on what's going on in your life, that may be really easy. You may know what your body's feeling, but that may be hard too. So pay attention and name your emotions by what your body's feeling physically, by what your mind is feeling and experiencing. And then the fourth step would be to choose one moment of the day and pray from it. Sometimes people focus on forgiveness in this step, if that's kind of the focus of that part of the Examen. But it can really be anything of any moment of your day so far, and that's what leads your prayer. And step 5, to end, would be to look toward tomorrow. So to reset, to think about how you can move from where you are. So how does doing something like this help us grow in our faith? Well, it forces us to kind of stop and recognize God's presence in our life and to pause and just to be still, which is hard to do often. It helps us develop more discernment in our life. And, as we practice these things, it's probably easier to become more and more aware of God's presence and God's voice in your life through people and experiences. Practicing the Examen can help us keep company with God throughout the highs and lows of the day. It helps us foster gratitude. I mean, if you're doing step 2 of paying attention, of reviewing the day with gratitude every day, then you're probably learning how to become more grateful, or at least expressing your gratitude more easily. It can help us become aware of our growing edges that we need, of our God-given desires as things that we really enjoy in our lives. It can also help us become more intentional with our connections with other people too. It's not just about, if you're reflecting on your day, you're probably reflecting on the interactions that you've had with people throughout the day. Then it also helps us become more aware of our own feelings and our own intentions, which, again, we don't often stop to think about those things throughout the day. So there's many different ways to practice this. You could just run through the 5 steps where you're sitting, think about it in your head. Great. You can ask more guiding questions. What am I most grateful for today? What am I least grateful for today? You can kind of do both things. When did I give and receive the most love today? When did I give and receive the least love today? What was the most life-giving part of my day? What was the most draining part of my day? You can kind of make it more of a reflection question experience. A lot of people, practice this daily, but you can also, if daily is a lot, you can also do a weekly examine, which we're going to do together through this chart that you see on your handout. And this is kind of a rest, reflect, and reset chart. And then some people, you can just do the examine every month, maybe the beginning of the month. This is kind of your practice of, let's think about the last 30, 31 days and how do I want to reset for the month ahead? And then maybe this is, even monthly is too much. Maybe this becomes your reset for the new year. You think about the year. It's a lot to think about the year in one sitting. But just any time frame can work for you and whatever is best for your practices. So this is the Examen. Any questions about it? Yes. Yes. Yeah. When you choose, that's why we start with gratitude because we want it to be something, we want those positive emotions, but the emotions that you're feeling in number 3 may not be so positive. And so wherever that leads you, you could have had a really challenging conversation earlier in the day or gotten some really not great news. And that can be what you reflect and pray and move on from. Because number 5 is the reset. So no matter if what you're thinking and focused on is positive or negative, good or bad, it allows you to move from that and pray from that. Does that make sense? Any other questions about this? Great. So we are going to practice this together now.